Hello, my name is Cherie, and today we're going to read the first 3 chapters of James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. This book is for Olivia and Tessa. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There was always plenty of other children for him to play with. There were the sandy beaches for him to run about on, and the ocean to paddle in. It was a perfect life for a small boy. Then one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up, in full daylight, mind you, on a crowded street by an enormous, angry rhinoceros, which had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had been sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing one pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I am sorry to say they were both horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nuisance," or "you miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books at all to look at. His room was bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Spudge and Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house at the top of a hill in South England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot far on the horizon, which was the house that he lived in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim in the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or picnic. And he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden," Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bush at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sandpit, and no other children were ever invited to come to the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat to keep him company. And as time went on, he became sadder and sadder and more lonely, and he used to spend every hour standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and the ocean that spread out below him like a magic carpet. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was only rather particular, soon caused a second thing to happen which was very peculiar. And that very peculiar thing, in its turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of the summer. Aunt Spudge and Aunt Spiker and James were all out in the garden. James has been put to work, as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in the deck chairs nearby, tasting on fuzzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes and a sunken mouth, and one of those were flabby white faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white spongy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed to one end of her nose with clips. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flakes of spit would come spitting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these ghastly hags, sipping their drinks, and every now and then screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face. Observe my shapely nose. Behold my silky locks. And if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker said, "how much my tummy shows." Aunt Sponge was red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Beyond my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin, oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks and my pleasant, and so please ignore the pimple on my chin." "My dear old tout," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared, "or I wouldn't be fine. I'd capture all the nature's hearts and give them all the leading parts. The stars will all resign." "I think you've made," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block and the heat was terrible. He sweated all over. His arms was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began to think about the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this very moment. Some would be riding tricycles in the garden. Some would be walking in the woods and picking bunches of wildflowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would go down to the seaside, playing in the wet sand, splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned forward. He leaned against the chopping block and overwhelmed by all his unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," said Aunt Sponge. "Oh, Aunt Sponge," James cried out, "and Aunt Spiker, couldn't we all please just for once go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far. I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him!" cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now, get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind that clump of dirty old laurel bush that we mentioned earlier. And then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. Chapter 3. It was at this point, the first thing of all, a rather peculiar thing that led to so many other more peculiar things happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard the rustling of the leaves, and he turned around and saw an old man in a dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a large black head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away and he stood there leaning on his stick and stared hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he beckoned to James with his finger. "Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put his hand in the pocket of his jacket and took out a small, white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of Jane's face. "You know what this is, my dear? You know what's inside this bag?" Then he came closer still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel the breath blowing on his cheeks. His breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag, tilting it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked so like tiny little stones or crystals, each one about the size of a grain. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminescent quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming from inside of it. And then he noticed all the thousands of little green things that were slowly, very, very slowly, stirring about and moving over each other as though they were alive. "There's more power and magic in these things than all the rest of the world put together," the old man had said softly. But what are they?" James muttered, finding his voice at last. "Where do they come from?" "Ha!" said the old man. "You'll never guess that." He crouched closer now, pushing his face still closer and closer to James, until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin on James' forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began to wave. He'll wave his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues," he cried. 1,000 slimy crocodile's tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights, with the eyeballs of a lizard, and the fingers of a young monkey, and the gizzard of a pig, the beak of a green parrot, and the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week, and let the moon do the rest." All at once he pushed the white bag into James's head and said, Here, take it. It's yours." Oh. So that's the end of chapter 3 of James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. We'll start chapter 4 next time, and thank you.